So today is a super simple guide for first-time composters. So as gardeners, we've all got some sort of interest in compost. But the idea of making our own can be quite intimidating, scary, seem overly complicated, almost like you need to be a rocket scientist. So it's understandable why some people get put off. But making your own compost doesn't have to be scary. So let me see if I can take some of that scary out-of-home composting and show you how you can be making your own too. So I'm not going to give you all of these rules and regulations, and I'm not going to expect you to memorise the different types of bacteria that are involved. I'm not even going to ask you to memorise tables telling you the components of all the things you're going to add. Instead, I'm going to give you the real basic, simple starter for making your own compost. And hopefully, once you've got the hang of the basics, you can then take that anywhere you want and get into the more in-depth stuff if that's what you're after. But for now, let me give you my top tips for starting to make your own compost. So maybe you've got really heavy clay soil, or the opposite, maybe you've got a really free draining sandy soil. Adding organic matter in the form of compost can help you get on top of those types of soil and make them absolutely brilliant for growing in. Or maybe, like me, you grow in raised beds, containers, pots, all of which need quite a lot of compost to fill them up and keep topping them up year on year. However it is that you grow in your garden, making your own compost can just help you because it's convenient to have it on hand, and it can save you a little bit of money. Even if you can't make all the compost you need, making some of it just helps to chip away at those bills. So I said I was going to keep this super simple, so let me give you a little visualisation of what the whole composting process is. If we've got all that bacteria eating all of our garden and kitchen waste and what have you, to get the best compost, we want to make sure they've got a nice balanced diet. I said I was going to keep this simple. So think of that balanced diet like this. 2 food groups. We've got green and we've got brown. Okay? Now, the whole colour thing's a bit strange because the greens are the high nitrogen things. So it's things like, you know, your leafy cuttings from the garden, all that kind of thing. Now, don't get too caught up on the term green and leafy cuttings because some things are high nitrogen, physically are brown, but they still fall into the greens category. But I'll give you a list. Browns is the other food group, and browns is the high carbon elements. So you've got green and brown, and your perfect compost is a mix of those 2 groups together. And to get it perfect, there's a way you decide on how much of each you add. But first then, let's talk about what you actually add. So greens then. Okay, it's like this. It's things like your grass clippings when you mow the lawn. They're high in nitrogen. It's all the little prunings and bits and pieces you do when you're tidying up your garden. It's all that soft green material. So even your weeds when you're weeding, as long as avoid putting the seed heads in. It's even things like your kitchen scraps. So when you peel potatoes or chop the heads off of carrots, all of that can go in as greens. And coffee grounds, that's a green. Tea leaves, I'd avoid putting the bags in because a lot of them have plastic in them, but the actual tea leaves, that can go in as a green. And a lot of you will already have heard of manure, animal manure. That's a green and can go in, but you want to avoid any manures from carnivores, so stick to herbivores like horse manure, cow manure, rabbit manure, that kind of thing. So the other side of it is browns. So we already mentioned all the prunings from the garden as your greens. Well, the flip side, all the leaves that fall off the trees in autumn, that's one of your browns. If you've got sort of dead branches and things, chop them up really small, get them in there. Again, that's browns. Bark, sawdust, that's browns. Even things like shredded paper and shredded cardboard goes in there as browns. But cardboard boxes, make sure you take the packing tape off because you don't want any of the plastics and things. And with your envelopes, if they've got the little windows on them, take them off too because you don't want that. Another good one is straw is a good one as a brown. That's your two different groups that you're going to add. A top tip I will give you is chop everything up really small. If you've got a shredder for those browns, go mad and shred them because the smaller everything is, the smaller pieces, the quicker it'll actually compost, the faster the process will be. So we've talked about the two groups, the greens and the browns, or the high nitrogen and the high carbon. How do we do this then? And that's the key thing. So this is the bit that some people find intimidating because it can get quite complicated when you get seriously into this stuff. But essentially, there is kind of a recipe, okay? So the perfect compost is done with a recipe of 30:1. It's a ratio of 30 brown or carbon to 1 nitrogen. Now here's the thing though, it's not by volume, it's not 30 handfuls of brown to 1 handful of green. That just would not compost, that would take forever and the compost would be sucky. The way it works is that every element has both carbon and nitrogen in it to different extents. So to do that ratio, you need to know how much is the carbon to nitrogen ratio in each element and then do a little bit of maths, okay? And that's why people get put off composting. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to say, for now, put that on the back burner, and I'm going to get you to work with just volumes for just now so that you can get the hang of the basics and the feel for this. And then once you feel like, oh, I've got this, then you can go out and explore more and you can get really in depth into your ratios and the carbon and nitrogen elements in each. So what I'm going to get you to do then is to go with a simple volume recipe, and I'm going to say start with 2 parts brown to 1 part green. Okay, now like I say, this is not 100% proper, but it'll let you get your head around things and let you get the hang of the whole composting scenario before you get into the complicated stuff. So what that means is then, if you're adding, say, 2 buckets of brown, it could be a mix of paper and leaves from autumn fallen trees, all that kind of thing. You want to add 1 bucket of your green. So that's all your weeds and your trimmings from the garden, some of your lawn clippings. You don't want to have too many lawn clippings in it though, because they can get quite pongy. Okay, and that's what you want to mix up together and add. What do I mean by add to what? Well, it doesn't matter. You can have just a pile in the back corner of the garden. Lots of gardeners have done this for years and it works brilliantly. You can, if you want, make a contained area for it, which is very traditional. A lot of people just use, say, 3 pallets tied together to make a kind of U shape, and you pile your materials in there and that's your compost bin. Or you can buy an actual bin for your garden if you want, and they come in lots of different forms. It doesn't matter, all of them do the same job. And you keep adding your browns and your greens mixed together and get them in there, and you'll see this start to churn over. Now, there are actually 2 other ingredients I haven't mentioned, and they're quite simple. The first one is oxygen, okay? So all that little bacteria that's in there, it needs oxygen to get eating all of that waste and turning it into compost. There are bacteria that will do it without oxygen, but those are the ones that cause the kind of smelly stuff, so we tend to avoid them when we're making compost if we can. So stick with the oxygen-loving aerobic bacteria, and to do that, just make sure that there are little air pockets in your pile, and you can do that by leaving in a few bigger items like pieces of bark or bits of twig, or you can even do scrunched up balls of paper, or like I do, is you can just give it a mix every now and again to let some air in as well. Okay, the other thing to add, or the other thing to know about, is moisture. Okay, if the pile is too dry, the bacteria won't be able to work, and if it's too wet, they won't be able to work. So the ideal amount of moisture is that if you take a handful of that composting material and give it a really good squeeze, it should all clump together and you should not get more than 1 or 2 drops of water dropping out of it as you squeeze it. And you should then be able to crumble it up again really easily. It shouldn't all stick together. So that's how you know you've got just the right amount of moisture in that pile. You can obviously, if it's too dry, you can add some water, you can give it a spray with a hose, or you can add more greens and that will add more moisture to your pile. And the same goes for if you feel it's too wet, you can add more brown to help dry it out. Now, here's a thing to be careful of though. Depending on your environment, you may, if you live somewhere really warm, you may need to keep an eye on the moisture and give it a spray with a hose quite often. I don't, because I live in a very wet environment, so instead I have to cover my compost to stop the rain getting in and soaking it. So just keep an eye on things. And the other thing you might find is if your compost is too wet, it'll get stinky and sludgy because as it's waterlogged, it all compresses down. And remember that bacteria that likes the oxygen versus the one that doesn't? This is when it happens. You'll get that anaerobic bacteria because there's no oxygen, no airflow in there, and that's when it gets stinky. So keep an eye, and those are your ways to fix it. If it's stinky and wet, add more brown, get some air into it. If it's really, really dry, add some greens or add some water, spray it with a hose. So really simply then, you want to add a mix of greens and browns to the ratio of 2 parts brown to 1 part green for this very, very simple composting recipe. You want to keep an eye on the moisture, not too wet, not too dry. So you want that Goldilocks moment, and you want to make sure there's oxygen in there. If there's any problems, you can fix it by, if it's too dry, add moisture or add more greens. If it's too wet, add more browns and make sure there's some airflow in there. And that should get you a good start in making your own compost, and it will let you get the hang of the basics. And then, if you want, once you feel like, I've got this, you can start investigating those other ratios and the content levels of carbon and nitrogen in each item and how you want to work with it. You're in control of your compost now. Oh, sorry. Off you go, guys. See ya.